So when one of these transcurrent faults starts growing, if you have different markers, whether these are fences built by humans and roads that are the fault's going to cut across, or more likely out in nature, this is a series of hills or rivers or beach ridges or some linear feature that the fault happens to cut across. When the fault is very young, it's only affecting a couple of them. As the fault ages and grows larger, it starts cutting across and deforming more and more of them. Now you can see this one doesn't really have horsetails in this simple drawing at the bottom. At the top, it has a little bit of the horsetail design. So it's a little bit of horsetail, a little bit of pure dying out through plastic deformation. And that's why, like in this top one, marker 3 and marker 5 are distorted, even though the fault has not reached them. There's plastic deformation that's relieving that strain, or relieving that stress. Strain is that plastic deformation. We can see if we have a series of small faults that have formed initially, and they're all in the same linear trend, but they're not straight lined up with each other. There's these little step-over zones, basically a different type of accommodation zone. The classic accommodation zone is a little step-over, area that needs to be connected between extension or compression areas. So either the accommodation zone between the ocean ridge rifting areas, or the accommodation zone between compression, uplift, and or subduction zones. And in those accommodation zones, you get transform faults. So how do you transform faults, a type of strike slip fault. So what happens when you need an accommodation, a filler between strike slip faults? Well, you get either compression or tension, so you either get rifting or not subduction, but uplift and reverse faults. So in this top step over zone, because of the motion of the plates, or the, not plates in this case, I'm sorry, the motion of the blocks on either side of the faults, we see the underside of this fault is moving up, and it's right in line with the top side of this fault that's moving down. So there's pressure there. So we get a ridge. It's kind of hard to tell that this drawing is a ridge, that's why they labeled it. But we can see from these fault symbols that we're getting reverse faulting. We're getting stuff getting thrust up towards the middle where we get a ridge. So there's lots of pressure there, so we have reverse faulting and a ridge. On the other hand, this step over zone, the underside of this fault is moving up, and the top side of this one's moving down. So in the middle here, there's an area where everything's being pulled apart. So it's a tension zone. We get lots of normal faulting with a big depression in the middle. So in this case, even though an accommodation zone and a step over zone are sort of two words for the same thing, it's the space between two other structures that needs something to happen to connect the faults or rifts or convergence. When it's connecting the subduction zones or connecting the rift zones, it's called an accommodation zone, and it gets strike-slip faults. If it's connecting strike-slip faults, it's called a step-over zone, and it gets reverse faults or normal faults. On the other hand, within a strike-slip fault zone, because not every strike-slip fault is, a simple line. This is thick rock, miles and miles and miles thick. As it's sliding past the rock next to it, you get a whole zone where the rock is breaking and deforming and sliding. And it's not just as simple as, a textbook sliding across the surface of another textbook. In that zone of deformation, you can get other small transform faults that are occurring to help handle that displacement. Some of them are close to parallel to the primary motion. Right here, this primary motion above this transform, or this strike-slip zone, is moving to the right, and the bottom below the strike-slip zone is moving to the left. And this large fault is probably a transform fault. It's probably going to reach other faults or plate boundaries. However, within it, these little ones that are close to parallel are definitely transcurrent. They are not ending at another fault. They're dying out. These ones that are close to perpendicular to it would be transform faults. They're ending at another fault, basically the edges of this large fault. But you notice, some of them are close to parallel, some of them are close to perpendicular. This is kind of like, what we saw when we had the dominoes or the deck of cards, and we sheared it in one direction, and within it there was displacement along each card sliding past each other. So that's the ones that are, fairly close to perpendicular are kind of like that. The ones that are close to parallel are the rock splitting and sliding because we have this big fault zone instead of a simple fault plane. We can see this happening in the laboratory if we take like blocks of wood or metal or whatever, and we have a big solid chunk of clay sitting on top of it, and then we start sliding the blocks like a strike-slip fault. The clay deforms with some strike-slip faulting, but also with lots of little faults splaying off within that zone of deformation. If we look at the top of it, we can see there are some that are pretty close to parallel and some that are close to perpendicular. And these are the Rydell shears. This is because the crust is going to deform mostly brittly, but there is plastic deformation as well. Here we can see close up where they had marked circles on the top of the clay, little circles and large circles, to help see the displacement that occurs. You can see here, like this semicircle was with that semicircle, this big semicircle with that one. So lots of displacement there. Over here, less displacement. Different amounts depending, because there is plastic deformation as well as brittle deformation within that fault zone, and lots of little faults occurring. So, this is a drawing, this is an actual photograph showing you that, hey, it really happens. It's not just somebody can draw it like that. We can also get folds and thrusts en echelon, so in series. And again, this is going to be same as before. Top moving to the right, bottom moving to the left, and we're getting this kind of folding or thrusting. Kind of depends on how brittly or plastically the rock is going to behave. If it's more plastic, we're going to get folding. If it's more brittle, we'll get thrusting. The point is that there's compression involved, and you can see this if you take a piece of paper, hold it between your hands, and then do some shearing motion. The paper gets wavy. These are en echelon anticlines and synclines. So you just created your own strike-slip anticline, syncline structures. Now, if you need to pause this to go grab a piece of paper to see if this really actually does happen, go ahead. If you trust me, that's awesome too. Now, sometimes you can get those en echelon folds, and then they get sheared and offset because, a fracture happens down the middle of the fault zone or somewhere within the fault zone, and you get strike-slip motion that then cuts those en echelon folds in half, and you get cool shapes.